look, a country is a coalition, a party is a coalition, groups are coalitions, right? So if you got France is a coalition, you got white French people, you've got people who have come over recently as immigrants, you have people whose parents and grandparents came over from countries that were colonized and oftentimes oppressed and genocided by France, who have some generational angst against the French colonialism. You got a lot of things going on in France, and in that, European countries, through their colonial aspirations, basically screwed up a lot of countries, in the Middle East and Africa, and those people are over there. They created a dynamic where a lot of people left those countries that they had blown to hell and overthrown and came to Europe, and the Europeans then were like, hey, great, it looks like the oligarchs were like, hey, hooray, this is wonderful, we've got some cheap labor that we can use to displace the indigenous labor of the Frenchmen and Germans, etc. That's going to work for us. So they could blow up the countries, they could destabilize these countries, and they could get some fresh cheap labor over here. They were happy, right? And meanwhile, the Europeans so let me say this about you guys, sometimes you guys can be a bit of knuckleheads, love you. Instead of looking at the oligarchs who were destabilizing countries and bringing over cheap labor, the Europeans got mad at the cheap labor. They got mad at the immigrant who comes over here, not the person who blew his country up. You know what that reminds me of? I always say, sometimes on Twitter, I'll tweet something and a person will get caught up in the word. They don't see the whole tweet. They'll get caught up in a word in the tweet. And I'll say, it's like pointing for a dog. You ever notice that? You got a dog and you point to something. They look at your finger. You're pointing, look over there, Rex, look. And they're just looking at your finger. They don't understand the concept that that finger represents something they should do. They look at your finger. They don't look at that you're pointing at something. There's a mountain lion running towards us. Look, Rex, hey, that's a nice finger. You want me to look at your finger? I'll lick your finger. That's the way dogs think. And that's the way I see the Europeans and Americans also, when they look at their border and they say, look at all these stinking immigrants. And I'm like, there's a reason we just bombed the crap out of their country and overthrew that. We just destabilized Syria and 2 million Syrians showed up at our border. Do you think maybe there's a connection? And the Europeans are like, those darn Syrians. I'm like, oh, it's like pointing and they're looking at your stinking finger. Are they dogs? For God's sake, people, wake up. These oligarchs have done something to bring cheap labor to replace your job, and you get mad at the cheap labor, not at the oligarchs who created the dynamic to replace your job. The oligarchs moved your factory, closed it down, and moved it to China so that they could get cheap labor, and you get mad at the Chinese. You're looking at my finger. It's pointing to something, you idiot. That's the way I feel about Europeans and Americans sometimes when it comes to understanding the dynamics related to immigration and cheap labor. I say all that to say this. There is instability. I was going somewhere with that. All of these things create a level of internal instability. The austerity that's forced upon these countries. Hey, guess what? We got to now spend 2% of our GDP buying bombs from the Americans, which is less money to fund the pensions. So we're going to move our pensions back for 2 years, and the people in France are going to get pissed. We're going to take some of the things that hardworking Europeans and Americans have earned, have voted for, have gotten accustomed to over the years, have every right to as a member, as a citizen of that country. They've earned that stuff. Right. And now you're going to take that from them because you got to spend more of your money on the budget, handing money to the military industrial complex in the US and corruption in the EU. Right. So there's internal instability. As a result, as NATO goes further and further away from the needs and the security needs of Europe, it's no longer a country, and they can no longer, NATO can no longer even make the argument that it's there to protect the Europeans from attack by the Russians, to secure the Europeans. It is now clearly an aggressive military organization that is focusing its aggression on Russia and China as a result of the US. And what is it? Is it a coincidence that the US says we're focusing all of our aggression on Russia and China? What about you, NATO? Yeah, we're focusing all of our aggression on NATO, on Russia and China too. Coincidentally, not that we're a puppet organization for the United States, but they are. Someone says, out in, yes, dogs can follow where we point. I'm not saying it doesn't happen on the occasion, but it ain't the rule. Most of the time, you may find a dog every now and then that can, but or more often than not, dogs are going to look at your fingers. And as I said, this wasn't about dogs. This was about Americans and Europeans when it comes to understanding the dynamics of their jobs being replaced by cheap labor, by their oligarchs, and not getting pissed at the oligarchs, getting pissed at the cheap labor, right? Your jobs being moved to China, not getting mad at the people that moved the job to China, but getting mad at the Chinese, right? That's the concept I'm getting at. So this ain't about dogs pointing, if you get the picture. I wouldn't want to get caught up in the discussion about the words I'm using when there's a philosophical foundational point here I'm trying to make, which ironically kind of spins us back into that whole thing, doesn't it? That let's not get caught up in the pointing. Let's talk about the foundational value of what we're discussing in the first place. All right.
Thanks for watching the video, and please consider liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing to the channel. Thank you very much.